Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode 3, part 1 of this video series where we are putting together the 84-inch CYModel Lavochkin La-7. I say part 1 because I've split up the installation of the ailerons and flaps into two roughly 10-minute videos, and in this episode we're going to be setting up the control horns and getting the servo pockets ready for those great high-tech servos. So without any further ado, let's head over to the bench and get to work. Alright, first we're going to start with installing the control horns, and if you'll notice, you will have to cut these, trim these down a little bit. The aileron horns are longer than the flap horns, but just to let you know, you will have to trim those down. So right now we're going to test fit these, and depending on how the aileron was put together, it might go in a little wonky at first, so you might have to get a knife in there to clear out some excess of the layers of balsa. Here's a shot of the shorter flap horns, just to give you a good example of how small those are. So we're gonna have to be really careful with the glue to put these in. So normally, to cut away the covering underneath the plate, you would usually use like blue painter's tape. But in this case, I'm going to go be really careful because this covering is painted. It's actually white covering that's painted this aqua blue. So I got these really small, sticky little tabs to go as easy as possible. What I'm doing is kind of making a square around that plate, so I know how big that plate is. And what I'll do is I'll get a brand new blade on an X-Acto knife, and we're going to cut away a square inside the square created by the little sticky tabs. So normally, if you're using regular covering, you can just use blue painter's tape or some low tack paint. I was just being extra careful here. We'll get rid of these tabs and we will use the blade to pull away the covering that we just cut. And when we go to fit this on here, you'll see that this will give you that ability to have the G10 plate and wood direct contact with the glue, but also it's going to be inside the plate, so it's going to look really nice when we put this on. And we've moved over back to the aileron, and just to see, look how nice that looks. We have that exposed wood underneath, but the plate will overlaps there and makes it look really nice. So the next step is to take the horns and very loosely scuff up the portions that will be glued. You do not want to take a lot off. You just want to scuff the surface to give the glue some extra surface area to adhere to. And you see, it looks like I'm going over a bunch, but I have a really light touch and I'm just scuffing up the surface. And don't forget to scuff up the plate as well, just really quickly. You just saw like 4 or 5 swipes and you get some nice scuffs on the bottom. So for this plane, I'm moving over to the Loctite, the 60 HP. So this epoxy is really nice. You need to use the 3M gun or an appropriate gun with the nozzle. And in case you've never seen what these nozzles do, here's a nice shot of that epoxy being mixed for you as it comes down the tube. You can see how nice and less messy this can be with the use of these nozzles. However, they're one-time use nozzles, so you do have to buy a bunch of them. So the goal is to pretty much coat the bottom half of the surface because when you insert the horn into the hole, it's going to coat the rest of it. And if you coat the whole thing, put too much glue, it's just going to come out the sides and you have a chance of it being kind of messy. So you really only need to do the bottom half, make sure it's covered, and the bottom and the sides, make sure to get those two of the control horns. So I have these really thin cotton swabs that I like to use, especially for this. I'll roll that epoxy on the end, and I will use these small toothpicks to really get and coat the sides of these holes, these slots for the control arms. What you're seeing right here is me just working some of that epoxy down in these holes as well. After that's done, we'll coat the exposed balsa and we'll insert the horns. Now, this is one way to do it. This is coating all the pieces separately because when you put the horn in through the plate, now you're kind of creating, you're kind of scraping off some of that glue. So this is the first way. This works fine. And you can see there's a little bit of epoxy on top of the plate there because we put the glue on before we inserted it. When we do the flap, we'll do it the other way. But we can see here, this is on here, looking good. And just to be safe, to get some alignment, we'll put one of the ball links in there with a bolt just to let it go. And so now make sure that's seated in there, and we can wait overnight for that to dry. So here is where you would assemble everything, put the horns through the plate, and then put the glue on the ends. I do it both ways, just kind of depends on what I'm feeling, but you'll see how this goes on. So we did the G10 pieces. Now we'll go back, get the toothpick, and work the epoxy into the slots for the horns, and we should be good. So the goal with this was to kind of do the first steps that you would do maybe the first evening you're doing this. Get the horns all in there, glued, setting up, let them dry overnight before we start with the hinges. And so that's where we're at right now. Now, for me, for this flap, the slots were a little bit wide, so we had a lot of play. So I definitely wanted to put a ball link in here with a bolt to get the alignment as it sets up. And with the Loctite E60, it does take 60 minutes at least for it to start setting up. So you have some time to play around with it. And then, you know, after that first hour, you can go back and check every 30 minutes to make sure everything's good. So let's start with these Servo Pockets. Now, normally these are just taped on the outside, but the factory didn't do this because I believe they wanted it in there so they could then paint, and plus they didn't want tape on the outside to possibly pull off some of that tape. So it's held in there with some double-sided tape, and this is how I found the best way to get it out. Just kind of, we know we're gonna cut that hole for the servo arm, so just poke a hole in there and use a little tool to pull it up. And after I pull this up, you'll see the double-sided tape and how these are attached. So just to let you know, this is how they are. They're not that easy to get out, but this is the best way I found. So again, we'll cut the hole for the servo arm in this block here. Always recommend doing something like this. Use a brand new X-Acto blade, and that's what I'm doing here. And I just go around pretty nice and easy. And what's funny is that when I'm done with this first take, you'll be like, Moose, that looks pretty terrible. And this is just the first take. You can just take your time and go around the edges, get it nice. In this next shot, you'll see how nice. Just a little bit of 2 more minutes of working with got these oblong holes looking really good. There you go. Again, key is a very sharp X-Acto blade. So next, very simply, we need to poke the holes for the mounting screws. So I just have a little poker here. The holes are already in the balsa wood, so I just kind of poke through the covering from the back and then from the front. We'll get these holes poked, and we will then drill the holes to mount this to the wing. Just using a 1/16 bit here to create the holes, and we'll pull the servo block out. So now let's run in the hardware that we're going to use to secure these servo pockets with. I'm using some really nice servo mounting screws from RTL Fasteners. And we're doing this and you're like, there's no servo in there. Yeah, we're just establishing the threads in the holes that we just drilled. So next step, we'll go ahead and get the ultra thin CA. Just like we did earlier, we are going to just strengthen those holes to establish those threads and we should be good. Just a few drops in each hole. Thanks for tuning in. This is pretty much what you might do on the first evening. Everything we've done, everything we've glued, we can set and let that dry overnight. And we will be back soon for part 2, where we'll take care of all the pin hinges and connecting all the hardware, the turnbuckles, and we'll go from there. So thanks for tuning in and see you next time.